The HX Stomp is an absolute beast of a unit, and by this point I have owned the flagship Helix, the LT, and now the Stomp. And I've always been blown away by Line 6's ability to jam-pack as much as humanly possible into these tiny units. And when I found this guy on Facebook Marketplace for only 300 bucks, I decided to do an entire pedalboard build just off of the HX Stomp. And if you have not seen that full video, you can check that out right here. But in this video, I want to deep dive into everything you need to know about building a pedalboard around the HX Stomp. And my hope is that I can help you get past some of those initial learning curves and prevent you from making some of the same silly mistakes that I did when building my own pedalboard. If you are new here, please like, please subscribe, and let's dive into today's video. There are a ton of different ways you can wire your HX Stomp in your pedalboard build. I've seen people use it solely as their effects unit, for amp sims, or as a MIDI controller. And in my personal case, I am using it for the amp sim and the dry effects, but then I'm routing through the effects block to my Eternity and my Revelation for my delay and my reverb. Before we even get started with our build, I strongly recommend visualizing everything by using a pedal planner, such as Pedal Playground or Pedal Train's planner on their website. In this case, it's going to help us visualize everything in our space and set up how we think our board will look once we get everything together. Again, I've got a detailed video of that right here, but another huge factor to consider with your HX Stomp is going to be your power supply. And in this case, not all power supplies are going to be powerful enough to power the HX Stomp. In this case, I purchased the TrueTone CS6 and used one of the 9-volt 500 milliamp outputs, and then used the red and the green converter cables to power my Stomp. And of course, you don't have to go with TrueTone. There are tons of other options out there like you'll see in the description. But in this case, that is what worked for me. Once you've landed on your power supply, you're also going to want to start to consider some of the cables you'll need for your build. In this case, I purchased a headphone adapter and then a separate USB cable to plug into my computer for an audio interface. And if you use a MIDI controller, you'll also want to factor in MIDI cables, or if you use the effects block, you'll also need a TRS to Y-split cable. I'll talk more about this later because I made a lot of mistakes here, but be sure watch to that part as well if you have questions. Now that we've got some of the basics out of the way, I want to dive more specifically into the different wiring options available. And if you are finding this video helpful, give this video a like. At the highest level, I've routed my board pretty simply. In this case, I'm going from the input of my pedalboard to the input of the HX Stomp, and then using the Stomp for my amp and my dry effects in some modulation, then going through the effects block using that TRS to Y-split cable to the Eternity and the Revelation, and then sending that stereo signal back into the auxiliary input of the Stomp, and then going from the output of the Stomp into the output of my pedalboard. And in this case, if you're planning to do something very similarly, you'd follow the same example, except of course, if you don't have a pedalboard where it's got a 4-way through switch, then you would just go directly into the input and the output of the Stomp. And if you are planning to use the effects loop of the HX Stomp, be sure to also add an effects block in your signal chain. I'd also recommend lowering the input that hits the effects block because this did create some distortion and crackling when I was listening through my ears or trying to record. In this case, once I dropped it to around -10 decibels, it fixed my problems and sounded great. I am also using the Jet Micro as a MIDI controller to unlock additional foot switches on the Stomp. In this case, there are less expensive options out there, but they are much more limited on what you can and can't do with them, specifically a TRS style foot switch, whereas the Jet Micro gives me full MIDI capabilities, and I can also use it to use additional foot switches, go up and down banks, assign tap tempo, use it as my tuner, or even for my looper. If you do want to purchase the Micro, check out the description and there is a 10% off coupon in there as well. One final adjustment I plan to do with this build is use the HX Stomp for its tap tempo and send it out to the Eternity through a MIDI to TRS cable. Another way that I've seen people route their pedalboard is if they want to have all of their wet and dry effects hit the front of the HX Stomp, like you would if you were playing through a real amp. And in this case, that's a super straightforward build, and you're just gonna route your pedal board and have the HX Stomp at the end of your signal chain. And now for the most fun part of this video, which is where I get to tell you where I screwed up and hopefully you don't make those same mistakes. And in this case, I had to reroute my pedal board 3 different times. So hopefully you don't have to do that as well. First and foremost, I recommend considering where all of your input and outputs are gonna be on your stomp before you put your build together. In my personal case, I ended up leaving barely enough room for the headphone adapter, and in this case, I would probably have routed my HX Stomp on the other side of my board to more easily access that. I'd also strongly recommend considering where your USB input is going to be, because this is going to be the easiest way to update your stomp or record if you plan to do that. One other mistake that I made originally when I routed my board was I routed from the direct output to the Eternity and the Revelation to the output of my pedal board. And the issue that this created was you could only hear my wet effects if I plugged into an audio interface or to the front of house. This is where I had to learn to purchase that TRS to Y split cable. I'll put a link down in the description if I was using the send for stereo on the effects loop. This then fixed the problem where I was able to now hear my wet effects even if I plugged in through a USB for recording or if I plugged in headphones to the HX Stomp. And if you are not planning on sending a stereo signal out from the HX Stomp, you'll just use a simple TRS to TS cable into the input of your wet effects, and then use a mono block for your effects block on the HX Stomp. Another seemingly simple thing to be mindful of is if you are planning on using MIDI, to consider your MIDI cable direction. Most MIDI cables are pretty blocky, and in this case I used a right-angled MIDI cable from Rockboard, and this worked perfectly for my Jet Micro. Creation Music Supply also has some really fantastic MIDI cables, but of course there's a lot of options out there. But again, just be mindful of how much room this will take facing out of your HX Stomp if you are going to use MIDI. And hopefully this video was helpful for you, and if I missed anything, be sure to comment down below. And if you're still on the fence of whether or not you should purchase the HX Stomp, check out that video right here. I'll see you next time. Bye.